Good evening, class. You're most welcome for the second session of this lecture. We are looking at prophecy in Israel. Yesterday, we looked at the introduction to prophecy. We looked at the different definitions of who prophets are. We looked at the task of the prophets. So, this afternoon, we are going to be introduced to yet another subtopic, that is categories of prophets in Israel. And we shall eventually look at the similarities and differences between true and false prophets. But before we go to that, let us look at the categories of prophets in Israel. Majorly, there are 9 categories of prophets. One, pre-exilic prophets. Pre-exilic prophets were those who prophesied before the Israelites were exiled into Babylon. And such prophets included Samuel, who was called to prophecy when he was very young in the house of Eli, and the second was Elijah, who was famously known for the contest at Mount Carmel between prophets of Baal and Elijah himself during the reign of Ahab. Then we had Prophet Amos, who was known for his prophecy of doom and eventual hope. We had Hosea and First Isaiah. The second category are the exilic prophets. These were prophets who prophesied to the people of Israel during exile in Babylon. They included Ezekiel and second Isaiah, known as Deutero Isaiah. The third were the post-exilic prophets. These ones prophesied after the exile when the Israelites were back into their promised land, and this was majorly Trito Isaiah. Then the fourth category are the canonical prophets. These were prophets whose messages were written down. They prophesied, and what prophesied were written down in their own names. They include Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and many more. Then pre-canonical prophets. These were prophets who prophesied, and their prophecies were not put into writing under their own names. They included Moses, who was a prototype prophet, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha, Micaiah, Ahijah, Shemaiah, among others. The sixth category were the major prophets, and these were prophets whose prophecy or the volume of their books was very long. For example, Isaiah had over 60 chapters, Ezekiel had very many more. Then minor prophets, the volume of their work was small, and all of them were put into one scroll known as the 12. They included prophets like Amos, Hosea, and Joel. Another category were true and false prophets. They were categorized as true and false prophets based on how they tried to do their work. True prophets were said to have received their call or vision from God. They included prophets like Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, Elisha, who were promoting the Mosaic law and the covenant relationship with God. False prophets were those who proclaimed themselves, they self-appointed themselves to become prophets. They included Zedekiah, among others. So, before we proceed, this activity has to be carried out within class in 5 minutes. 1. What are the similarities and differences between true and false prophets? You just give 3 similarities and 3 differences. Then activity number 2. Examine the characteristics of true and false prophets. B. What evidence is there in Uganda to show there still exists false prophets? So I'm giving you in total 5 minutes plus 10, 15 minutes to do this exercise. Then we're back to present our findings. Thank you. Okay, I hope you are done. Can we present our findings? Okay, due to challenges of technology, we're not able to present, but next lesson you're going to present. But let me give you summary of the findings of the similarities and differences between true and false prophets and their characteristics. Similarities. These are the highlights of the similarities between true and false prophets. One, both the true and false prophets claimed to be called by God. And that's what they told the people, that the messages they were given to them by God. Two, they both spoke for and on behalf of God. That's what they claimed. Three, both foretold the future. They predicted the future events using the powers they said either came from God. And they also performed miracles. These prophets performed greater miracles. Typical example, Prophet Elijah, who was able to organize a contest on Mount Carmel between prophet of Baalis and himself, where over 4,000 of the Baali prophets were killed. And both were concerned with the problems facing their communities. You know, that time the Israelites communities were facing a lot of challenges from neighborhood, wars, and so on, including idolatry. So the kings were facing enormous challenges, and their prophets would always come to guide the king to tell them how he should proceed. So they used symbols to explain their messages. Except is the prophet Jeremiah, who decided to preach using the valley of that is Ezekiel, the dry bones. Then we have both of them also claim to have visions from God. If you read First Kings chapter 13, verse 18, you'll find that many of these prophets attributed the visions they received from God. And they took part in national affairs, like leading prayers, like organizing, you know, uh, celebrations, like the feasts. Prophets were in the lead, just like our religious leaders are doing today. And they tried to intercede for the people. Moses was interceding for Israel when God would do something. Same was with Samuel. Same was with Isaiah, Amos. They pleaded with God to change, including Hosea. Then both the prophets claimed their ethical and social concerns to the Mosaic law covenant. So we're yet going to see if these similarities exist when we look at the next level of our exercise today. So the next exercise we were supposed to carry out was to look at the differences between true and false prophets. So what are the differences? What shows that a prophet is a true prophet? What shows that this prophet indeed may be doing something which is not correct? He's trying to fidget to be called a prophet. Now let's look at the differences. True prophets were called by God. Meanwhile, false prophets were self-proclaimed. They just declared themselves prophets without God's anointment. True prophets prophesied what people out there wanted to hear. What is happening in a rural district now, what is happening in Uganda, is what a true prophet will tell without mincing words, without sugarcoating it. But false prophets prophesied what their audience wanted to hear, particularly the kings, because they were looking for favor. True prophets gave prophecies of doom, that is, destruction and disaster. For example, Prophet Amos, Prophet Ezekiel, Prophet Isaiah, they all prophesied doom. But false prophets gave prophecies of prosperity and peace. Always that which makes people happy. True prophets opposed bad acts of king. For example, Nathan confronted King David after he committed adultery with Uriah's wife, that is Bathsheba. But false prophets were yes men to these kings. They will always appreciate because they wanted to be supported. True prophets lived pure lives according to the covenant tenets, according to the Mosaic law. But false prophets often were moral. True prophets used divine powers from God, while most of the false prophets used divinations and magic to predict their future. They worshipped Yahweh, that's true prophets, but false prophets worshipped idols and hidden gods. For example, the prophets of Bali. True prophets were got their revelations to prophesy from God. Meanwhile, false prophets looked for what to preach. We're going to look at pictures of divination after this slide. Their prophecies came to pass. This is for true prophets. Meanwhile, false prophecies, their prophecies never were fulfilled. Lastly, they worked to promote Mosaic law as true prophets, while false prophets worked for gains and for pay and for favor. That's why they are referred to as professional prophets. Finally, here are some of the ways through which false prophets got the message they want them to speak people through divinations. We've been watching Nigerian flicks and so on. Then you find that this is what happens. Sometimes when somebody causes an offense, people will gather around, they'll put you in the middle, they dig holes, then they begin to say things, chantings and incantations develop. So next time uh, we'll be looking at other topics, including now pre-exilic prophets, one by one. Thank you very much for your participation. Meet again.